Hello everybody, this is Fun Police and I am back with my first deck tech for the World at War Behind Enemy Lines. If you've seen my card review, which was posted just a little bit ago, you're going to see that the card I was probably most excited for was Chasing Shadows. There's a lot of different decks that I'm currently trying out with it, but for today I want to share a deck tech that puts it into US Frontline. This is a archetype that very much does care about the tempo and has numerous cards that can pay off for having the front line, which Chasing Shadows can enable for very cheap. However, I have been thinking, Chasing Shadows is obviously a French card, so what else in France works really well with it? Well, Phoney War is quite strong in many decks. You're able to play a bit more of a combo-oriented hand and then just refill. So, with Phoney War being such a powerful draw, I've gone ahead and done something very different with this deck. There is no M4 Sherman in it. And that is definitely something that you won't see probably anywhere else. The M4 Sherman is a, powerhouse card in the US aggro frontline decks. However, due to Phoney War, alongside the other incidental draw that we have in this deck, I've opted to replace the M4 Shermans instead with better threats such as the M4A1 and M4A2. What this has done is it has allowed our deck to essentially play like US Frontline, but have some extra kick in the late game. We have pretty much the same speed and can even sometimes out-tempo our similar decks, but we have the benefit of that little bit of extra late game oomph and a little bit higher card quality because we're not having to run the Shermans. Plus, it also works that Phoney War ends up helping us even if we don't have the front line, which can be something that happens with the Shermans. So this is a really weird deck, and granted, this is all being recorded and these games have been played through on the first day. So we're going to see some really weird games, and this deck is not facing off against the absolute most meta lists possible. So there is a little bit of a caution to be advised there, because maybe after people stop trying out new stuff, this deck gets worse. But I've been having a lot of fun with this. Without further ado, let's jump into the card choices and why I've built the deck the way it's built. Starting off, we have Chasing Shadows. I've already talked about this. It's going to help enable our frontline synergies. It's able to pull enemy units into the frontline that can disrupt placements, namely pulling out high-value targets that are otherwise behind guards, or maybe just bringing a unit they don't want forward and then killing it. That's very effective, but normally I've found that you're mostly playing this on your own units and then pushing it into the front line to cause a big headache for the enemy, where they have to now immediately deal with threats and they can't contest the front line as effectively. Then we have the 109th Combat Engineer. These guys are bog standard for US Frontline. They're a cheap one-drop, and then they're going to buff all your other ones. They usually sit in Smokescreen. Very resistant, hard to remove because it's just so cheap and you've got other threats that are going to be actually killing people. Really good card. We have Red Devils, probably one of the best one-drops in the game at the moment. It's a 1/3 blitz, so it's pretty resilient, but it also has that +1 credit. Enemies have to pay +1 to target this unit. That is a huge roadblock against stuff like other aggro decks, and even Control can find it awkward to deal with. So Red Devils ends up being a really sticky way to control the front line and allow our other units to squeeze into it. Very effective. You can even play Red Devils and Chasing Shadows turn 1, and I have actually done that in a game and won because the enemy just essentially doesn't have the front line and I'm able to develop bigger threats and just keep pushing them into the front line before they can deal with it. 32nd Infantry is the next one. Very standard infantry unit in reality. These guys are just essentially drawing each other. They're cheap cycle, cheap bodies to flood the board with. Very helps a lot with consistency, you know, and is still just a 1-drop, so you have something to play on turn 1. Just a very good card overall. Then you got the 507th PIR. The 507th is a really good 2-drop. It's a 2/3 infantry with smokescreen, obviously. And then at the end of every turn, it's buffing one of your infantry units, and it can buff itself. So even if you play this out just on its own turn 2, it's going to be a 4/3 infantry that's going to keep growing. That's really good. But I've also, you know, you can also play it down, and it's going to buff up other infantry. Particularly nasty if you have Red Devils in the front line, and that becomes a 3/3. That can be really strong. Then we have 99th Infantry Battalion. The rework to the 99th has made them very strong at snowballing a board. They are not able to bounce enemy units anymore, so we have less ways to punch through guards, but we do have a big benefit of being able to buff up one of our units. Again, in combination with something like Red Devils, 99th can potentially just like win the game outright. But even if we don't do that, being able to put this guy, because of chasing shadows, we're often able to, for usually like 2 credits or 3 credits, we're able to play something down, push it into the front line, and 99th it, allowing us to immediately establish a strong board presence. Then we have the HOTCHKISS H35. This is one of our French cards. This is essentially a 2-credit, 1 operation cost tank. It's a 2/3, and it gets +1 attack when you deploy a non-French unit. Due to the nature of how this deck is, we're deploying a lot of non-French units, so the HOTCHKISS essentially becomes a 3/3 or even a 4/3 pretty consistently, and that's pretty good for a 2-drop. It's definitely had its time. I've definitely seen it perform quite well, applying decent pressure. Good at trading, I think, is one of its biggest aspects, because 3 attack early on is really, really important, and because it's on a tank, it's able to move into the front line and trade. And it's just overall, I think, a very cost-effective tank. Then we get to the one kind of meme card in the deck, and that's the M24 CHAFFEE. So CHAFFEE has been one of those elites that has always been something that everybody loves to play, but it really sucks. I think Chasing Shadows has taken it from total garbage to just kinda garbage. Being able to turn 3 put 2 CHAFFEEs in the front line is actually a pretty good play. That's a lot of pressure the enemy has to face down. And if you can pull this off late game and use something like We Can Do It, you can make 2 4/5s in the front line for about 8 credits. That's pretty good. Like, it's not the worst thing ever, but I do think that in refinement, the CHAFFEE sadly doesn't make it, but I can't let it go. I gotta have the CHAFFEE memes. So that is why it is in here. Then we have 2 M16 half-tracks. These are another pretty standard card for US at frontline. There are bounce. They're able to bounce guards or enemy, like usually enemy guards or enemy aircraft. And that can be a very strong tempo swing because it's only 3 credits. I think it helps very much in that regard and gives us a lot of momentum that we can use to snowball with. Then we have Island Hopping. This is a very strong card that definitely feeds into a late game strategy or a long game strategy. Being able to just occasionally get +2/+2 for attacking the enemy HQ can help push units into over certain like AoEs and whatnot, or just helps us to snowball. And that is overall a very effective tool to have use of. We then have the M18 HELLCAT. This is another standard card. Very often this is just going to attack the enemy HQ as a 4/2 blitz tank, but we can also use it to train into some big tank if the enemy's blocking our way with it. We have the C-47 SKYTRAIN, very important threat, being able to constantly fill the board with random 1-drops. The only downside is that it is, kind of slow and takes up some support line, but in all honesty, it's very much worth it. Enemy is going to have to remove it immediately if they don't want to end up losing a lot or having to deal with a ton of 1-drops. Then we move on to Defend in Depth. This is another French card and gives us a removal order. And that's normally something that the US frontline decks don't get access to, is removal. or at least not efficient removal. Defend in Depths is arguably one of the strongest removal orders in the game right now, and with Phoney War, we can very consistently have this deal 5, 6, 7 damage. And that gives Defend in Depth a lot of flexibility in its toolbox. I've definitely run through like very large guards with it, thanks to this, but I've also been able to just remove really important threats, and that gives us some interactivity that the deck otherwise doesn't have. Then we have the M4A1. The M4A1 is serving in place of the M4 Sherman. Being immune to enemy orders, being a little bit bigger, the M4A1 serves as a better threat than the Sherman. And it also has some tech against discard if that ever makes a comeback, although it's not very common at the moment. The biggest downside again is probably that it doesn't draw on itself, but again we have Phoney War to help offset that, so the M4A1 I think overall fits better in this deck. Also very good with chasing shadows. You can play it down and on turn 4 have this in the front line. That's going to be really hard for the enemy to remove unless they're just willing to trade in several units. I think a very efficient card overall. We have the 101st Airborne. These guys give us a little extra interactivity because of their deployment to deal some damage to something in the support line. On top of just being a decent infantry, the ambush means that smaller drops have a hard time turning into it, and the 3, it's a little weak to removal, but it's pretty cost efficient at 5 overall. We can do it. This is one of the big cards for US Frontline that gives it its sort of mid-range status. It's card draw, it's a little bit of healing, and it also is turning our board into pretty much an AoE-proof board. It serves the similar purpose to here. We have a lot of cards that, like often are growing in attack, and then giving them that extra defense makes it very hard for the enemy to remove. Then we have Phoney War. I've talked a lot about this, but this is our main draw engine. Because of the nature of our deck, we're able to go pretty late into the game as long as we manage our resources well. So Phoney War gives us a great refill, and especially against something like a control deck that already is going to have like 7 or 8 cards in hand, this can essentially be like 5 credits, draw 5 or 6 cards for us, and they draw 1, and that's totally fine. It's a very respectable and very powerful engine. Then we have the M4A2. The M4A2 was a card that came out in World at War and really has not seen a lot of use because it is quite slow. But because we've cut the M4 Shermans out of our deck, I've managed to squeeze 2 copies of this into the deck. And it's actually done quite a bit of work. Especially against control decks, they have a really hard time dealing with 2 4/4s. It just adds a lot of bodies onto the board in one card and gives us a lot of late game durability. It also is essentially immune to like bounces and other things because then we get the deployment and we can essentially make more M4A2s. So like, for example, against like an enemy Leopold or like an RAF Lightning or a Churchill AVRE, the M4A2 actually can be pretty annoying for the enemy, and if they bounce it, they're giving us more 4/4s to play out. So this helps to give us that late game oomph. Then we have Strategic Bombing. Strategic Bombing is just a very good card overall. Hits the enemy HQ, hits enemy units, and they lose a credit slot. Just a very solid card overall. And then finally, SEABORNE Invasion. Because we're looking to take the game a little later than the standard US Frontline deck, SEABORNE Invasion makes more sense because we're going to be reaching that credit slot more. Being able to snatch the front line guaranteed is very powerful. We had 2 units there. It overall, I think, fits well as a top-end card. And with that, let's talk about some other cards that you could potentially include in the deck. I think because this deck is a bit slower, you could look to build this a bit more defensively also. Air defense, I think, is a pretty solid option to include. Blowing up, it blows up most early game units and then kills any air unit. That can be very useful and I think could be a legitimate option. Patrol is an option also. This is a flexible removal order and it does drop the guard. And unlike the half-track, this goes through any sort of guards, so you could potentially look that, but it does leave the body out, so there's trade-offs, upsides and downsides for both, depending on what you were looking for. First Marines is another option. I actually had this in the deck at one point, and you'll see in the games I actually was playing this and slowly tinkering it, so the decks are going to vary. And I think this is a fine card, but because of Chasing Shadows, we often have, I think, better options to get stuff into the front line. So the blitz on this guy was not as effective, and as such, I ended up cutting him for space. You could try out 7th Regiment, which does work with Chasing Shadows and kind of makes it like a slightly bigger Sherman, but it doesn't draw as much. But I don't think there's enough room, and I think we have better like 4-drops to make use of. There is always the Catalina if you feel like you need some more draw. That's a pretty strong card. I think that's definitely a very good option. And then I think there is a fun meme you could try out. If you have Chasing Shadows, you could potentially play the Pershing on turn 10 and then immediately push it into the front line. I think that's a really cute idea. I tried it out. It didn't really line up very often, so I think it's a bit too inconsistent, but it is maybe a fun meme thing if you want to do that. And otherwise, I think that's mostly all that there is. France doesn't offer a lot outside of the cards I already have in here. So let's just go into the games. But one word before we do. If you're liking the content, make sure to like and subscribe. And then leave a comment down below if you do play with this deck. Or just tell me if you want to maybe see a specific deck tech. And maybe I'll look into it and make a video over it. But otherwise, let's just get into those games. And we are back. So, as you saw in those games, the deck actually was changing a little bit, and we were facing some pretty weird decks. Stuff like the Soviet resistance in that first game was pretty weird, but like that's just kind of the thing of whenever you run into a first day of a new expansion, you're gonna see just a very weird deck, and we just we ended up winning all of the games, which was pretty surprising. I honestly thought in that discard game we would have lost, and also in the mobilize game, we would have kicked the bucket if the enemy had Commonwealth. You saw us trying to prevent that from happening, but thankfully he just didn't have it. Otherwise, I would have lost. And overall, you can hopefully see that this is essentially U.S. Frontline at heart, but it's potentially got some fun and unique interactions to it. I definitely think that there's still a lot of room to experiment. Again, I've only played this for maybe a few hours at best, because it's first day and I'm just trying out so many things. So if you do end up trying this deck out, head down into the comments and tell me if you've made any edits or if anything's working for you. I'm very curious to see if maybe we as a community could refine this deck, and maybe I could do a follow-up video after we get some refinements. Or just comment down below if you want to see if there's another deck you want to see me try. I definitely have a lot of things to show off with the behind enemy lines. But otherwise, I think that's going to be it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and have a good day.